on the last episode of the Keepsake box. Now, don't get me wrong, Lady was beautiful in her day, and I'd had the exact same level of excitement when Antonio gave her to me. But the Mercedes was different. That car had a level of luxury that I hadn't known existed prior to that point. I was convinced that I had made the right decision in accepting David's proposition. I liked the way I felt in that car. I liked the way I felt in that apartment. That's the life I wanted. That's the life I deserved. I drove the car around the city, feeling that I looked the part. I drove back to the parking garage and handed the keys to David. "What are you doing?" he asked. I was confused. I assumed that the car was offered, pending my approval, but the typical David audacity stood right back in. "I've taken all of the guesswork out of this, sweetheart. The car and apartment are yours. I don't know when your lease expires, but there's no need to wait that out. I'll pay any amount owed for the breaking of your lease. As for your car and clothes, I'll connect you with some people who will donate them for you. It'll be a nice little tax write-off." In my excitement, I had forgotten all about the arrogant side of David, but he was always sure to slide something back in that reminded me. David's comment took me back to something that Grandma always said. Her voice came creeping into my mind. "Never let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." Unfortunately, that phrase reminded me of Ron as well. David assumed that I was renting my house, and I decided to let him think that. If things didn't work out, I knew that I'd always have a place to stay. And as for Lady, I had too much emotional attachment to simply donate her. I decided that I'd just park her in Grandma's garage. But in the meantime, I had a new car to name. I decided to call her Simone. David reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. He addressed me. "I've taken the liberty of arranging an itinerary for tomorrow to take the guesswork away. This is just to get you started. I trust that you'll manage your time accordingly after that point." David exited the car and walked over to the driver's side. I stepped out as he opened the door. For the second time, David kissed me. He smiled and said, "See you tomorrow, Shelley. Please be on time." David walked away, leaving me with the car, the apartment key, and the note. I thought about the series of events. What would an itinerary entail? I unfolded the piece of paper. It started with me having breakfast with David at 7:30, followed by the 10 o'clock meeting with an interior designer. I had a meeting with an image consultant at 1 o'clock. I would meet with a nutritionist at 3 and a personal trainer at 5. Lastly, David would be at my new apartment to pick me up for dinner at 7 o'clock. And that was the official start of my relationship with David. Chapter 9, Envy of Our Friends. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Everything went according to plans. David was meticulous and exact, but he did everything he said he'd do. I met with an interior designer who turned my apartment into everything I could ever have imagined. Even more so, it was beautiful. The nutritionist served double duty. She arrived with nutritional information and actual food. She set a plan that was targeted towards my goals, well, the goals that David had set for me. David had groceries delivered to me every week, all of which were on the nutritionist's approved list of foods, of course. The nutritionist had me on a low-carb, no sugar, no gluten, no pork, no beef, no nothing diet. For the most part, I ate chicken, seafood, eggs, fruits, and vegetables, and the occasional almond. It was more difficult than I could have ever imagined. Most days, I woke up with a growling stomach and met my slumber in the same manner. But eventually, I adjusted and it became the new norm. I met with a personal trainer who set a grueling workout schedule. I hadn't ever worked that hard in my entire life. I stuck strictly to the diet and workouts, and I saw the results in my body. I hadn't ever been a person who cared to diet or work out. According to Grandma, all Black women should have a little junk in the trunk. But that wasn't the accepted standard in my new world. All of the women were slim and toned. I considered myself to be a bit of a project. I challenged myself and I saw the results. After it was all said and done, I was 25 pounds lighter. David had only requested that I lose 10 to 15 pounds, but I went above and beyond. It was extremely difficult, but I rewarded myself with the understanding that I was fitting in, and that was enough for me. I met with an image consultant who overhauled my entire look. Harder than changing my diet and exercise routine was changing my look. I was attached to my look. It was the last part of my former life. My wardrobe changed immediately, as David made sure of it. But after a while, everything changed. I no longer got my hair braided. No one in my new circle got their hair braided. David preferred that I wear my natural hair completely straight or with a light wave pattern, and I did as he requested. I also let go of my signature nail art. I was attached to my French manicure with the star, diamond, and gold line, but again, it didn't fit into my new life. Reluctantly, I let it all go, and David rewarded me by getting my breasts redone. They were perfect. David did his part and I did mine. I chose an accounting program. David approved of my selection and paid for it. Not only did he pay for it, but he made sure that I attended the best school in the state. I worked hard. Having completed most of the prerequisites years earlier, I completed the accounting program in 3 years. I did that while keeping up with David's grueling workout schedule and attending all of his social obligations. But it was worth it. I secured a high-paying job with one of the most credible companies in our cities. Thanks to my affiliation with David, of course. David introduced me to everyone who was anyone. In time, I was included in the everyone who was anyone. Just as David said I would, I became one of the most influential women in our city. I loved being in that position. I learned a lot in those first few years. David was a trust fund baby. His father was a wealthy business owner and investor. His mother was a professional socialite. David's father left many businesses and properties to him, including the high-rise building in which I lived. I learned a lot about the haves, and I learned even more about David's circle of friends. It was true that Chad and Sean were lawyers, but they weren't quite as honest about Mandy and Tina. Both Mandy and Tina had started as temporary secretaries in legal settings. While Tina had completed an administrative program, she wasn't making much more than a receptionist. And Mandy pretty much was a receptionist. David made me aware of those facts for a specific reason. He wanted to make me aware of the differences between us and them. Do you see how people look at you? He'd ask. Without ever waiting for an answer, he'd tell me, "You're credible. You look the part and you live the part. You work in a credible profession. You don't have to lie or stretch the truth. You're an actual complete package." David had a way of building me up in that way. Even with that being so, he never let me forget that he had placed me there. He never said it outright, but he'd brag on what I had to offer and follow it up with something along the lines of, "That's why I paid for you to go to the best school. You'll never be like Mandy and Tina." I always knew that David gave himself sole credit for my success. I hated it as I felt that I had worked hard to reach my status, but that's who David was. I never had the time to feel accomplished on my own accord. He always boasted about the part that he played in my successes. But that was David's home talk. When we were out, he doted on me. It was as if I were the most important thing in the world. Nothing and no one came before me. I always managed to weigh it out. I had to deal with the occasional double-sided compliment, but I had the status that I wanted, and so was life. My friends were jealous, and they had no problem expressing that fact. I spent a lot of time with Mandy and Tina, and I started to understand why they were so impressed by my relationship with David. It was nearly impossible for them not to be. Chad and Mandy had been in a relationship for years. It was common knowledge that he was cheating. Chad was always cheating, a fact that Mandy was aware of as well. Chad had no problem making Mandy think that she was the problem, and Mandy had no problem being convinced. Each of Chad's conquests was younger and prettier. Believing that she had failed to keep herself attractive enough, each cheating episode was followed by some enhancement on Mandy's behalf. In the years that I had known her, Mandy had gotten a nose job, liposuction, lip fillers, and a few other procedures. If he cheated with a blonde, Mandy went blonde. If Chad cheated with someone that was thinner, she starved herself until she was thinner. On one occasion, I spent the entire day with Mandy, watching her only ingest peppermints and water. It was quite difficult to see. I remember when Chad cheated with one of his business clients. She wasn't nearly as attractive as Mandy, but she was successful. Of course, that prompted Mandy to feel that she should go back to school. I was all for it. I hated that her decision was based on Chad's indiscretion. However, I felt that it was a good move for her. But in typical Chad fashion, he told Mandy not to waste her time. According to Chad, Mandy wasn't disciplined enough to dedicate herself to an academic program. I was so angry. I'd watched her survive off of peppermints. I certainly didn't have that level of discipline. Yet, Mandy took it in and agreed that she was in no position to further her education. That was their normal cycle. I sympathized with Mandy, as I understood the pressure that she felt. David had high expectations of me. He pushed me to look my best, do my best, and present my best self. I was aware that much of it was self-serving, but I didn't have the added pressure of feeling that he would cheat if I wasn't perfect. I just felt that I was upholding my end of the bargain. But Mandy's situation was different. Her situation with Chad was stressful, and that was obvious to anyone who spent time in her company. There were so many times I wanted to tell her that she deserved better, but David had clear-cut rules about our relationships with our friends. As David put it, we were to only concern ourselves with our own relationship. I had mentioned some things to David and told him that I was bothered by them, but Chad and Mandy had been together long before David and I met. If she had been dealing with him for that many years, my intervention wouldn't have made a difference. It's important to remember that that was David's take on it. Many times I'd heard Chad tell Mandy that he wouldn't ever marry her. She was aware of who he was, and she should have had a realistic expectation of where their relationship was headed. Even though I hated the situation, speaking up had no potential benefits to anyone. She was there and she wasn't going anywhere. And then there was Tina. Tina was married to Sean. They had been married for years. Tina was once a vivacious, attractive woman, but that was before life had beaten her down. Well, that was before Sean had beaten her down. Tina's whole life was structured around Sean and their children. He controlled her and took pleasure in publicly humiliating her. Tina was only allowed to be in the company of people who were approved by Sean. Mandy and I made the list because of his affiliations with our other halves. I was aware that Sean was both verbally and physically abusive towards Tina. While I hadn't ever actually witnessed the physical abuse, there was always a random bruise that was explained away. On one occasion, Tina showed up with a black eye that was poorly covered by foundation. When I asked about the circumstances, Tina told me that she had been headbutted by a toddler. Sure, that could happen, but it happened far too often. Either Tina was being abused or she was the clumsiest person alive. I didn't believe it was the latter. And it wasn't just the bruises. I could tell that Tina was terrified of Sean. I watched her flinch whenever Sean approached her. He didn't allow her to drive. If Tina was out with us, she was put on a strict schedule that she was expected to follow. Tina was allotted 1 hour for every occasion, without regards to the situation. If we met for lunch, we always chose a place where the wait was expected to be minimal. On more than one occasion, Tina had to leave prior to receiving her meal, as she was approaching her 1 hour allowance. I remember attending an outing with the girls. We ordered food and it arrived just as Sean was walking in to retrieve Tina. Knowing that she would not have time to package it up, Tina requested that we drop it off at her residence on our way home. Yes, seriously. Not only was she not allowed to enjoy the meal at the restaurant, but Sean wouldn't even give her a few minutes to package it into the to-go container. I watched Tina arise from the table with tears in her eyes. It was incredibly sad. I remember telling Mandy how much I hated Tina's situation. I wish she would find a way to rid herself of him. Everyone deserves to be happy. Everyone deserves to be free. That's what I told her. Again, I hated what she was going through, and I thought she deserved better. But because of David's stance, I attempted to keep quiet. I was, however, prone to the occasional outburst. I understood both of their positions. I had certainly been there, a fact that I shared, of course. I remember the feeling of not being enough. I remember trying my best and still feeling that I fell short. I hated that feeling, and I hated it for Mandy and Tina. I was in their company on a regular basis. I heard their stories and witnessed their woes, acutely aware that I didn't fall into the same categories. David was occasionally a jerk in private, but I never suffered the embarrassment and humiliation that plagued Mandy and Tina. As far as the world was concerned, we were the perfect couple. David wouldn't have had it any other way. Neither would I have. I respected David for the contributions that he made to my life, and I grew to love him. It wasn't that intense, I want to be around you all the time type of love. It was more of a very strong like. I wasn't extremely attracted to him, but I wasn't unattracted to him. The sex wasn't awful, but it wasn't great. Things were always very neutral with David. It was always right on the line. Everything was mediocre except our lifestyle. We lived the good life. We were 4 years in, and I still lived in the high-rise apartment, but I had no complaints. That apartment was amazing. My friends envied how I lived. David replaced the Mercedes twice. I got tired of naming them, so I decided to call all of them Simone. We traveled. We saw the world. We went to the best parties and events. David stood by his promise. He made me one of the most powerful women in the city. I was truly living the life. I often thought about Antonio. I wonder what he would think about my new life. Deep down, I knew the answer. Antonio would say that I was selling out. That's the thing about moving up. When you're exposed to a new life, it's easy to see the downside of your old life, regardless of how good you thought it was at the time. Undoubtedly, I enjoyed some good times with Antonio. We lived what I considered to be at the time the good life. But perception doesn't always equal reality. The good life was based on my limited knowledge of what life had to offer. I couldn't imagine that my life with David could get any better. I was wrong. I never imagined that it would get worse. Again, I was wrong. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.